American confidence. By the end of 1967, the American military command in Vietnam believed it had reached a turning point. Years of attritional warfare, large unit search and destroy operations, and overwhelming firepower appeared to be yielding results. Enemy casualty estimates were high. Viet Cong activity in many regions had declined. Intelligence reports suggested communist forces were strained, short on supplies, and increasingly pushed toward border sanctuaries. This assessment shaped American expectations going into early 1968. U.S. commanders believed the enemy retained the ability to fight, but not to fundamentally alter the balance of the war. Large-scale attacks against major cities were considered unlikely, if not impossible. Urban centers were viewed as secure, politically sensitive areas where communist forces would avoid decisive confrontation. That assumption would prove disastrously wrong. From a U.S. intelligence perspective, the final months of 1967 were filled with mixed signals. North Vietnamese activity increased in remote areas such as Dak To and Loc Ninh near the Cambodian and Laotian borders. These battles were interpreted as attempts to draw American forces away from population centers and inflict casualties in conventional engagements. General William Westmoreland believed the enemy was committing its main forces in these border battles, leaving its urban network vulnerable. The strategy of attrition, he argued, was working. What American intelligence failed to detect was the scale of infiltration occurring inside South Vietnamese cities. Under the cover of normal civilian movement, communist fighters entered urban areas in small cells. Weapons were smuggled piece by piece. Explosives were hidden in homes, temples, and shops. Fighters blended into neighborhoods where they had lived for years. Because U.S. intelligence systems focused heavily on radio intercepts, large troop movements, and rural reconnaissance, these preparations went largely unnoticed. The enemy was not massing openly. They were embedding quietly. On January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched a major artillery attack on the U.S. Marine base at Khe Sanh. Trenches appeared along surrounding hills. Supply routes were threatened. The base seemed poised for siege. To American commanders, Khe Sanh appeared to be the main event. The parallels to Dien Bien Phu were unmistakable. Westmoreland became convinced that the enemy was attempting to lure U.S. forces into a decisive, high-casualty confrontation near the border. Reinforcements were rushed in. Air power was concentrated. Khe Sanh became the focal point of American strategic attention. This decision, while logical based on available intelligence, had a critical consequence. It drew attention and resources away from the cities. In late January 1968, a ceasefire was expected for Tet, the Lunar New Year. Although some alerts were issued due to increased enemy activity, the holiday atmosphere led to reduced readiness in many areas. South Vietnamese troops were granted leave. Guard posts were lightly staffed. In the early hours of January 30th and 31st, communist forces struck. The attacks were simultaneous, coordinated, and widespread. More than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam came under assault. Provincial capitals were attacked. Airfields were targeted. Communication hubs were struck. From the American perspective, the sheer scale of the offensive was shocking. This was not harassment, it was a nationwide operation. In Saigon, the attacks were aimed less at territorial control and more at symbolism. Viet Cong units struck the Presidential Palace, the Joint General Staff Headquarters, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and most dramatically, the U.S. Embassy. At 2:47 a.m., a small sapper unit breached the embassy compound wall. Militarily, the attack was insignificant. The attackers were killed within hours. They never entered the main building. Psychologically, it was devastating. The U.S. Embassy represented American authority and security. Its breach, captured on film and broadcast globally, shattered the perception that the war was distant and controlled. For American commanders, the embassy attack was alarming not because of its tactical effect, but because it demonstrated the enemy's ability to strike where Americans felt safest. Across South Vietnam, U.S. and ARVN forces reacted with speed and violence. Firepower was applied aggressively. In many cities, communist units were destroyed within hours or days. However, urban combat negated many American advantages. Airstrikes risked civilian casualties and political fallout. Artillery use was restricted. Tanks and mechanized units struggled in narrow streets. Enemy fighters exploited the environment, firing from buildings, disappearing into crowds, and using tunnels and hidden routes. The battles were chaotic. Communication broke down, units fought isolated engagements, situational awareness was limited. From a U.S. military standpoint, these fights exposed weaknesses in urban warfare doctrine and coordination with South Vietnamese forces. The Battle for Hue was the most consequential engagement of the Tet Offensive. Unlike other cities, North Vietnamese army units seized and held large portions of the city, including the ancient citadel. They raised flags, established defensive positions, and conducted executions of government officials. This transformed Tet from a shock attack into a prolonged urban battle. For American commanders, Hue represented a strategic dilemma. The city was historically and politically significant. Heavy bombardment risked destroying it and alienating the population. Yet slow progress increased casualties. U.S. Marines and ARVN units fought house by house. Progress was measured in yards per day. Snipers, booby traps, and fortified positions exacted a heavy toll. The fighting lasted nearly 4 weeks. When Hue was finally recaptured, the enemy had been militarily defeated, but the city lay in ruins. Civilian casualties were high. Images of destruction circulated widely. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was catastrophic for communist forces. They suffered enormous casualties. Many experienced Viet Cong units were destroyed. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the south was severely damaged. U.S. and ARVN forces retained control of all major cities. No territory was permanently lost. American commanders declared victory. But victory in numbers did not translate into victory in perception. Television coverage brought the war into American living rooms. Images of fighting in Saigon, chaos at the embassy, and devastation in Hue contradicted years of optimistic official statements. The credibility gap widened. Public support eroded rapidly. Political pressure mounted. Confidence in military leadership declined. From the American military perspective, Tet was a paradox. It was a tactical victory. It was a strategic defeat. After Tet, the United States still had the means to fight, but it no longer had the illusion of inevitability, and that illusion, once lost, could never be regained. By the end of the Tet Offensive, the battlefield in Vietnam had fallen silent, but the consequences had only begun to unfold. From a strictly military perspective, the United States and its allies had repelled every major attack. Cities were retaken, enemy units were shattered. By traditional measures of warfare, the outcome favored American forces. Yet Tet revealed a truth that no after-action report could conceal. The war was not being fought only with rifles and artillery. It was being fought in perception, endurance, and political will. Tet exposed the limits of technological superiority against an enemy willing to absorb catastrophic losses to change the course of the conflict. It demonstrated that control could be temporary, security could be penetrated, and victory could not be defined solely by body counts or territory held. For American soldiers on the ground, Tet was a brutal confirmation that no place was safe and no engagement predictable. For commanders, it forced a painful reassessment of strategy. For the American public, it marked the moment when confidence gave way to doubt. After Tet, the United States did not withdraw immediately. The war continued for years. Battles were fought, lives were lost, but something essential had shifted. The belief that the war could be won quickly, cleanly, on America's terms was gone. Tet was not the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. It was the moment America realized the true cost of the war it was fighting. And once that realization took hold, the path forward would never be the same again.